Hey, good morning, good afternoon, everybody. This is Nathan with Oxford Partners. I'm joined today by my colleague, Matt Rogers, and we wanted to talk a little bit about the decision-making process, specifically for trades, looking at whether they should purchase or lease out property for either expansion, downsizing, relocating. Matt, how are you doing today?
I'm good. I'm good. Thanks for intro. Yeah, it's an interesting topic. A lot of the trades businesses have kind of different decision-making points than other businesses that need to be considered. Honestly, funny enough, that something I see a lot, and this can go towards just purely trades or just industry specific businesses, is that a lot of times they don't actually consider when their busy peak seasons are.
Yeah.
Like, how many times do you get deep into a deal or even just starting with these guys? And it's like for AC companies and their lease expires in July, or accountants that have their lease expire in March, like
Yep.
right in the middle of their peak season. And they're like, guys, I can't focus on this. So, from a strategy standpoint, I think just expanding outside of buy versus lease, I think there's a lot more strategy that can go into a lot of these decisions just by positioning themselves in a place where they're in a place to make a decision. Because a lot of these trade specific businesses, like you think contractors, roofers are always busy, right? Plumbers always busy.
Right.
But frankly, roofers tend to get busier when we're in storm season because there's damaged roofs. There's HVAC companies, obviously, are summer times. There's maritime businesses around cruise ships, right? That need to be busy when it's not they do all their sales when those cruise ships are back at port. There's so many elements to it if you really dig into it that are real interesting, but from just a strategy standpoint, I think they'd all be helping themselves if they could just get their lease expirations or their real estate decisions focused into a time frame of their year where they're not super busy because it just makes it harder for them. They can't move. Their cost of everything they lose if they're moving in their busy season is infinitely more. So I think just
Yep.
from a starting point, that's where I try to drive the conversations when we're kind of getting into it. Is just, hey, what can we do to get this into a better time frame for you guys? And I think that helps them just as much as getting deeper into the lease versus buy. It's just a starting basis at that, which would seem simple, but it honestly, I've come across it enough that I realize it's not.
Yeah. No, you bring up a really good point. Timing is incredibly important. And I think more so with leasing, right? It's almost like a rushed decision. A lot of folks don't realize that you can start these conversations 6 to 9 months in advance, especially if they're just looking at a renewal or expanding in their current facility. They'll start looking at these decisions 30, 60 days beforehand. You lose a ton of leverage, but then you're also rushed through this process that in reality can take a month and a half just to get all the paperwork drawn up and just to get an actual lease executed, not even mentioning negotiating deal points. And I have run into a couple of different deals where we've gotten further along and then my clients just go MIA. And it's because they are during their busy season. They only have so many hours in the day. Their attention is already divided up a million and one different ways. And this is the lowest item on the totem pole for them because, like you said, they have to keep their business running. And people don't necessarily realize that you can post-date leases. So, say your busy season, like the HVAC contractors, right? Say the busy season is June through August. They don't realize that they can work out a deal in May and have it dated to begin in September, right? A lot of these items are negotiable, and for the most part, landlords are relatively reasonable when it comes to timing as long as there's good reasons for it. It's not, we're just not kicking the can down the road or we're not delaying something for months for no reason. But if we can demonstrate to them, oh, we're too busy to give this the attention that it deserves right now. And the timing works better for us in the long run. In my experience, a lot of landlords have been amenable to that. They've been willing to be flexible for most of them. You always get one-offs. Most of them have been very professional in that aspect. And obviously, we never want to advise people to necessarily go into holdover We don't want to tell people to stay past their lease day because holdover can be a pain. You're getting charged 150 to 200% of your lease rate just to make some timing work. But if you have these conversations early on with the landlord, then I found that they're more flexible and more accommodating.
I couldn't agree more. And I guess getting back to trades and buying versus leasing, I also kind of feel like with trades groups, and you might see it different. We obviously do a lot of these types of deals, but we obviously have different clients and things, and they're all different shapes, sizes, and everything else. But the trades industry seems more prone to fluctuation
Yeah.
than a lot of other business types. Like when you're just dealing with straight manufacturers, they fluctuate, but their business line is still heading in a certain direction, right? It builds or whatever over time. Whereas with contractors and roofers, like trades industry, it's tougher to get a long term plan together because it is so cyclical for them. I've been in situations where I was working with glass companies where we were looking at tripling in size one quarter, and then the next we were looking at maybe downsizing. It's just, and that's an extreme example, but it's important when you're talking about companies that are in the trades industry because it is a bit more prone to that than some of the other industries that we see.
Yeah.
So it does make long term planning a bit more difficult. And that shows in the amount of lease term they can do, whether they buy, because if it's real hard for the most part, I still believe in buying over leasing for most companies that can financially make it work. Because I think over the long run, it's a better business decision to have the asset there. But it becomes a challenge for trades companies because they could very easily outgrow that building they just bought in 12 months. Their growth isn't as projectable as some other businesses are. So it does really create a challenge because our goal is obviously to sit down with everyone we meet, get a sense of where they're going, how they're doing, and help them try to strategize what's in the best interest for them. It's not just about the rate and the numbers. It's just as much about, hey, where do you see yourself in 3 to 5 years space wise needs? We need to start making a longer term plan if we're really going to set them up for success. And I feel like it takes a little bit more nuanced effort when you're dealing with trades companies, at least from what I've seen.
Yeah. Do you think the pace of fluctuation in size and their specific needs has more to do with busy season or more to do with potential contracts that they might have coming? The reason I ask is just earlier this week, I met with a group that is like metal fabricators, and
Mhm.
the lease or purchase of a building is contingent on getting some $12 million contract over the next couple of years with some company. And if that doesn't happen, then like you said, they may not need to double or triple their space.
Yeah, that's a big part of it. And also a part of the challenge of being in the real estate side for a lot of these companies and what we have to deal with is a lot of them start having us look for space under the assumption that they get rewarded the purchase order or the assignment of that contract or whatever it is that they're chasing. And you run all these traps on properties around the size that they think they need. But then if they don't get it, obviously it drastically changes what their needs are. So then it does get back to that last second battle of doing something last second that you were talking about earlier and just leaves it as at a place of less leverage. It's harder to get a better deal. So it is a challenge. As far as an answer to it, I think we see a lot of it because we have both corporate clients, but we have also a lot of family-owned local businesses that are a bit more prone to one new client, one new purchase order, one new agreement that gets in place that really does change a lot of things for them.
Yeah.
Whereas your corporate clients are more, they need those, but they still have their contracts in place and they get one, they lose one. It's not as big of a deal as it might be to a more local family owned business. And it's why I always said with loans and things, when they're looking at it, cash is king for a small business. So, as much as you can limit the down payment on purchasing or make sure that the overhead numbers on leases are right, or keep our clients from having to come out of pocket for build outs, is so important because that cash is everything. They buy inventory, they buy new machines, they can pay staff. I think that all factors, especially in industries where it's up and down. And a lot of these trades companies were hit pretty hard during COVID, frankly. The supply chain probably hurt them the most in a lot of these comparables. So I think a lot of them weathered that, and it probably taught some good lessons about budgeting and future planning. But I think it's why it's infinitely more important for people in the trades industry to have a broker and to have a team, honestly, around making these decisions, talking through it, and being able to make educated choices and decisions, because they are susceptible to downturns and also big windfalls when they pick up a contract or two. And timing is literally everything. If they can set themselves up around a situation, getting back to the first topic, where they can make decisions in a time frame where they're not in their peak season, I think that makes it that much easier for them to pull the trigger and make changes and plan for the future.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. When it comes to making the decision to lease or buy, I guess what different factors go into making those decisions? Because in my mind, it's really two things. For me, like two main things. It's never just two things. But on the lease side, what I think makes leasing more attractive to different trades is scalability, right? You can get into a lease term for 3 to 5 years, and if you outgrow it, you can expand. If you have wasted space at the end of your lease term, you can downsize. But then on the flip side, let's like you mentioned earlier, if you actually own the property, then you build equity through owning that property, and you actually own that asset outright. I can imagine that is a tough decision to make for industries that do have as much variance and their needs and their workflow and their, I guess, the amount of work that they are doing from year to year, or even from quarter to quarter sometimes.
Yeah, absolutely. Leasing, I think, definitely offers, to your point, a lot more flexibility, especially if they're not sure about what their long-term plans are or what their scalability is. Something that ultimately happens is a lot of times companies will hit a threshold where they're big enough where it makes sense to go to a model where they own distribution centers, even if they're smaller, kind of regional, local, and then they go and lease their sales stores. Or when they're looking to expand, they'll go and lease in new locations. And then once you have enough stores or locations, then maybe you look at adding a distribution center. And I think it's a safer avenue to buy those distribution centers because you're just using that to fulfill the other stores in that market area or that region, is what I've seen a lot of the trades companies do, because it does make sense to own if you know you're going to need something for 5 to 10 years, because you not only do you build equity, but you're also not just giving money away to a landlord and spending that, because that asset in most markets is going to be worth more than it is when you bought it. There's been very few areas of the US where buildings have lost value. So for these companies, again, I'm always a believer in buying, but you have to have a good understanding of what your growth looks like, because you could go buy something and it might not work 6 months later, which isn't ideal, but you can also go sell it. That is also maybe the beauty of buying too, is that you can go buy it, but you can always turn around and sell it, right? Whereas if you go and lease, you're committing to that amount of lease term. And although they can get out and sublease it, you're still owning the liability of that rest of that lease term. So I still think that buying, probably, if a company is in the right financial place to do it, is a smarter decision. I just think for trades companies, they need to really take a look at what their inventory needs are to fulfill their business, realistically what their pipeline for the next few years looks like. Try to piece together a plan around what type of building makes the most sense, what size of building, how can they take a building and have the ability to retrofit it to get more use out of it over time if they so need, and piece that together into a requirement list. And then you go look for that. A lot of times people are in 5, 10, 15, 20,000 feet, whatever the number is. And they're like, oh, business is good, so let's just look at adding 5%. And then they get a new purchase order and they need to double. If they had just looked at how much business they were doing with that client of theirs, they probably could have foreseen at least more growth than just 5%, but they didn't take the time to stop and look at it to try to make those educated decisions. To your point earlier, a lot of times people just want to wait to the last second where they're not really making a decision, that they're being forced into one by the timing. It's not them coming up with a proactive plan and attacking it. It's them being pushed into a decision because they just don't have any other choice.
Yeah, I think that leads pretty well into the next point I wanted to talk about, which is timing considerations for leasing and purchasing. I mean, I think timing deserves a lot more attention than most industries will give it, especially trades, as their timing is pivotal to their business. It controls what they do throughout the year. Like we talked about earlier, a lot of different trades have a busy season where the maybe 60-70% of their income is made over the span of a couple of months. What should what should people be thinking about, or what should these different business owners be thinking about when it comes to timing for leasing versus purchasing? And what are some things that maybe they just don't realize because this is not what they have to deal with every day? A lot of times these decisions are made once every 5 years or once a decade.
Yeah, it's a really good question and probably the most important question. A lot of times, people not familiar with leasing and timelines don't understand. Contractors obviously would, and some anyone that's around construction would understand this, but other trades really won't. Creators, other things that don't deal with it is permitting and build out timelines. If there's any substantial amount of work that needs to be done to the space, you could be looking at any from 2 to 4, 5, 6 months of build out time, depending on the extremes of the build out between architectural engineering, permitting, all of that, and to the actual physical build out. It can be a long time. And if you're only 4 months out and you need to do a massive build out, you're stuck. You're past your timeline. So realistically, a year out is really the perfect time to start having the conversations and looking at things. You may not need to start that early, but it makes the most sense to start that early, to start getting a sense of the market, start figuring out what you really are going to need. Again, everyone has a busy season for the most part. So that's going to hit within somewhere in that 12-month calendar. So that way, if you do lose a little bit of time during the busy season, it's not the end of the world. You're accounting for that and build out time. I know to a lot of people that'll sound like a lot of time in advance, but it's really not. It goes by a lot faster. The negotiation process takes longer than most people realize. Just lease review and back and forth takes some time. And if you're rushing through it all, things just have a tendency to get missed. Whereas if you can take your time and be more patient with everything, you just give yourself that much better chance to check all the boxes, make sure you're getting everything you want out of your new space, all that kind of good stuff. So I think realistically a year out. And you don't have to make a decision on where you're moving a year out, but at least start having the conversation, getting your decision team together to talk through what your growth looks like, what you want to look at, figuring out if you did move where you'd want to be, talking to a real estate person like us, to an advisor to understand what the market's doing. Interest rates are constantly changing. Our market conditions are constantly changing. So needing to understand that and to be able to make an educated decision is everything. So they're not going to be able to do that unless they have the right conversations and enough time in advance to be able to start processing it and then making decisions off of that. I think realistically, a year out is what I would say is the best time to start evaluating things.
Yeah, I agree with you. There's been too many times where, clients of mine don't give themselves enough time to make the decision, but the decision has to be made. For example, late last year or earlier this year, I worked with an electrical group, and they're doing all of the electrical work for this data center that's being built off Louetta Road. I don't want to give away the client's name because I haven't expressly asked them for permission, but if you drive by it, their name's all over the fences. They knew this contract was coming up. They had been in talks for maybe a year and a half about winning the bid, and then they won the bid, and all of a sudden, okay, the job starts in 2 months, and we need to find parking for 100 people. And The job site itself did not have parking for 400 people. We ended up having to reach out to grocery stores, office buildings that had high vacancy rates just to see if we could get rent reserved parking. Thankfully, we were able to find a multi-tenant office building that was sitting at 10 or 15% occupancy, very low occupancy, and they had two or three parking garages that were just empty. But it was maybe 3 or 4 weeks before their job was supposed to start, before they were supposed to be on the site doing their job. And we got to a point where we were so rushed that we had conference calls with between my clients, the landlord, everybody's attorneys, like 15 people on a Google Meet or on a Zoom call or just on a conference call to try to work this deal out. Thankfully, we were able to get it done. But imagine how much stress and how much attention that took away from actually getting ready to gear up for this job. And something on the purchase side that you and I have done recently, we say recently, over the past year or 8 months, with
Mhm.
a group that you and I work with, is negotiating in the rights to close early. As people are looking at purchasing property and they need the property. If we're looking at, if we go under contract in like late Q1, early Q2, but they need it by Q3, contract timelines are just not going to move that fast. So we've been successful in negotiating rights to close early so we can pull the trigger faster. I don't think a lot of necessarily only trades, but just people in general that are looking at purchasing commercial property don't realize the amount of time that a purchase by itself takes. And especially if you are financing the deal, the different requirements that the bank is going to have. What's been your experience with that? And you were the one that said we need to put in the right to close early. I feel like that came from somewhere.
It just came from experience over time where I had clients that where something changed and they needed the timeline of the project moved up. And we just needed to get access to the facility to start doing our build outs and things sooner. And the seller, for different reasons, whether they were moving out or they just weren't ready to sell or they had a 1031 issue, whatever it was, prohibited us from being able to close faster, which would have made things better for us. But that's something that could have been discussed earlier on or put in there. So unfortunately, it was learned from experience where it hurt us versus helping us. It's one of those things like you see a lot of things and you learn from them and it just makes you better as you go. But it also was from learning from that I put it in on one and it saved the deal. My client closed, and had we not done that, they would have actually backed out of the deal because things were changing. And if they couldn't get access, they were going to blow the deal up and just go lease something from a neighbor. That would not have been ideal, but it would have been the only thing that fit the timeline. But we were able to close like 40 days early, which is crazy. But it got them into the facility fast enough to honor a job that they got from one of their biggest clients. So I think what it really gets back to, especially for trade companies, is flexibility. Like maintaining an amount of flexibility with real estate is very difficult in theory because you're locking yourself into a lease, you're looking at buying, and you have to be creative with where you find the flexibility. But that only happens from working with the team, working with agents, making educated decisions, and not waiting to the last minute. For example, I have a deal that we've been working on for a few months now. We were pretty close on a lease, but frankly, they're related to oil and gas, and they have partners that are overseas in the Middle East. And some of the stuff with Iran and the Strait completely changed the dynamics of what was going on for their company and some of their clients and partners. We ended up having to back out of that lease deal because our needs drastically changed for what the facility needs were going to be. And talking with them and coming up with a new strategic plan, somewhere we landed on is it does make more sense to buy at this point because we don't know what their needs are going to be in a year, 2 years, 3 years, but we know what they need now. They can buy a building that suits that need. And then in a year or two, we can turn around and sell it and go and move into something that fits that new requirement. And this is one of those deals where we know that it's drastically going to change. So locking ourselves into a 3 or a 5 year lease doesn't make a ton of sense because we'd be signing up for knowing we're going to be having to sublease that and move. Whereas you can go and buy a building, not lose value. You just you can either build equity or at least just hold the exact same cost. So it's less money out of pocket in the end. And it gives you the flexibility to go and make the move when you know, or when we have a better idea of what they need. And that was strategy that we came up with and talking with the decision maker and them just asking us what we thought. And we came to that conclusion that was the best option. But it's only in finding where the flexibility can be for every scenario. That's probably what's going to be the most important to trades companies being successful with their real estate decisions.
I agree with you. Flexibility and timing. Matt, do you have an example, a story, case study, something that might be more relatable to some of these trades companies out there?
I guess we can go positive and negative kind of experiences that have happened. The business that had a pretty terrible situation happen was a freight forwarding business. They were up near the airport years ago. They were chasing like 3 or 4 contracts and got final stages with a couple of them. I think they were in like 15 to 16,000 feet at the time. And we were looking at 65,000 to 80,000 feet. It was a big jump because
Oh,
they
wow.
felt really good about these projects. And we obviously got down to where we were ready to sign a lease on one, but then they found out that they didn't get one of the contracts. And then they found out they didn't get one of the other contracts. And then there was just one left. So I tried to call a meeting to say, hey, obviously we don't need this much space. What do we need? Their lease expiration was coming up. I had suggested for months that we at least establish a dialogue with the current landlord as a plan B, just not to have all our eggs in one basket on moving for these contracts that they had not yet been awarded, that they had leased out their current space. By the time I went ahead and reached out about options in the park, they had leased out their space. So we ended up having to scramble. We did find them something else, but it was more expensive, honestly, lesser quality building. The loading was not as good. It wasn't as good of a fit for them with what they needed. And it really could have all been avoided if we just realistically set a game plan up with them and they had listened to the repeated suggestions to not close off the possibility that they may not get them and just to have a backup plan in place because you just never know. They obviously want to win all those contracts, but they just don't. And if they don't win them, they don't need that extra space. And their current space might be totally viable for what they continue to need for the next few years. So unfortunately, that was a bad situation that could have maybe been avoided. And obviously, if they had won those contracts, then we would have been in great shape looking at those bigger spaces. But it just didn't work out for them, unfortunately. And I feel like that's just a lesson learned, obviously, for them. But other people in the trades industries can take note of that because their business can be cyclical like that. And trying to just set up stop blocks to make plans and talk through strategy is, I think, infinitely more important when you are trying to figure out how big or how much space you really need and for how long, and strategize about where you're going and what you need to do. A positive one, actually, was 3, 4 years ago. I was working with a plumbing group who were growing. They were doing pretty well, but we had been talking about a purchase and about budgeting and everything else. And they were playing their budget conservatively, which I appreciate. They weren't stretching it, but it made it harder to find what they were looking for just because it was a specific need, specific area of town where their clientele was. The size range made it difficult. And then as we were looking, I came across a building that was bigger and more expensive than what they needed. And there was some hesitation around it, but it checked a lot of the boxes of what they needed. It had the right type of storage for their parts. It had the right sales layout for their people. It had the right amount of outside storage area for their fleet of vans that go out on site to do the repairs. And we ended up going ahead and moving forward with it. And they made the numbers work with their lender and they bought it. And 2 months after they bought it, they picked up their biggest contract they ever had gotten before, simply because they actually had the space to offer the services of what this client was asking them to do. And they came back and were obviously appreciative because they would never have gotten it had they not taken on more space. And it doesn't always work that way, but sometimes it's around finding something that works for them and going after it. Because a lot of times in their industry, so much can change so fast that they don't know what the bigger future holds when they don't have the space to support it. So we see it on both ends, and trades companies, again, are more susceptible to the ups and the downs, which I think lends itself more towards, as you're kind of getting started growing, that the smaller trades companies, I think leasing makes the most sense. But once you've been established 5, 10 years, have repeating revenue, I think it does make sense to look at buying, because even if you grow out of it, you can always sell it. And then obviously, as you're growing more, like I said earlier, finding kind of regional distribution, and then you just have sales stores from there where you supply those stores as needed, becomes a good, useful business model I've seen for multiple clients I have that we've come up with that are in the trades industry. But it's all, again, about strategy and keeping flexibility and making the right decisions at the end of the day.
Totally agree with you. To wrap this all up, the two biggest takeaways that I would take away from this is give yourself enough time to make this decision, to give this decision the attention that it deserves, and so that business owners and these different tradesmen and women are not stretched thin attention-wise or energy-wise. Again, there's only so many hours in a day, and these are big decisions that will impact you and your business for years, negatively or positively, right? And flexibility, understanding that there are different options out there, there are different strategies out there, being open to that. There's multiple ways to do these deals. There's multiple different factors that go into making this decision. And then ultimately, hire a broker. Hire a broker, get a professional. Matt and I can swing a hammer, but I'm not gonna do a lot of this stuff myself because I don't necessarily have the time to. I don't necessarily have the attention to. Similarly, these decisions and these transactions, they take a lot of time, they take energy, they take a lot of attention that if these business owners are trying to do themselves, it takes away from their business. It can take away from their business. Preferably hire Oxford partners, but at the very least, hire a broker that you trust and that you feel comfortable can consult you and lay out these different options and help point you and guide you all in the right direction. Like always, thank you for taking some time to listen to Matt and I talk through this different options versus leasing or buying for a very nuanced group of businesses. If y'all have any questions, comments, concerns, feel free to reach out to us. Matt and I are always available to chat, to lay out different options, or just kind of talk through things. This is what we do every day. We both like doing this. We both like talking about real estate. So we're always happy to chat.
Absolutely. Yep. Couldn't have said it better myself. Timing, flexibility, strategy is the name of the game. It's fun, Nathan. Thanks for taking some time to talk through it.
Yeah, absolutely. Have a good day.